So far, you've been introduced to primitive objects, and if you remember, those are your basic 3D objects, your building blocks that you can create a lot of forms with. Now, to just work with stock primitive objects is pretty limiting. But what if you wanted to, say, taper the leg of the crab or bend its arm? Well, that's where objects known as deformers come in. Deformers allow you to deform existing shapes in many interesting ways. So let's go ahead and in this video, let's cover some of the most commonly used deformers and how we can use them to deform some of the geometry, make up our scene, and make our crab look a lot more interesting. All right, let's start out by tapering the base of the eye here. And you'll see that as I selected this object, you cannot see it in the object manager. And that's because, remember, we have this object nested underneath this left eye group null. So one easy way to be able to quickly reveal your object within a hierarchy is to just select the object and then move your cursor over to the object manager and hit the S key. This is the scroll to first active key, and this will reveal inside of a nested hierarchy your object. So now you can quickly add other objects into that hierarchy or add children to that selected object. Now, what I want to do is to taper this object. So what we're going to do is go into our deformers menu. This is our deformers menu right here. You can see it's represented by this little bent cube. And if I click and hold, you're going to see a whole mess of different types of deformers. And you will notice that they're all the color purple. Now, you'll notice that we also have objects that have the color green. And it's important to understand and distinguish between the colors of objects and how they relate to what type of objects they are. Now, all of these objects that are color-coded purple will manipulate and distort objects or data, okay? So they're not going to generate new geometry. They are just going to deform existing geometry, okay? So let's go ahead and choose a taper object here. And you're going to see that the taper object is represented by this big bounding box here and these arrows that are pointing inwards. Now, these bounding boxes with the arrows are really trying to tell you and inform you which way your object is going to kind of taper into. So if I go to my taper object, go to the object tab, you'll see we have this strength option here. Now I can either scrub here or scrub this area here, and you'll see as I bring up the strength percentage here that this bounding box is tapering on this side of this little cube bounding box. So these arrows are very helpful indicators of what this deformer is going to do. Now you'll notice that this object, this taper object, is not actually deforming anything at all in our scene. And that's because for a deformer to deform another object, it needs to be made a child of the object you want to deform. So our left eye base is the object that we want to taper in or deform. So what I'm going to do is grab our taper object and just drag this underneath as a child of this left eye base. And remember, if the arrow is pointing downwards with that object highlighted black, that means you're going to make that selected object a child of this highlighted object. So if I release my mouse, you'll see that this taper object is now a child of this left eye base, and you'll see that this just deformed just a little bit. Now, if you want to deactivate the taper, you can click this checkbox. It's going to change to an X, and it's totally going to go away. It's going to deactivate that deformer. So you can see the before and then the after. If I click that X and turn it to a checkbox, you can see that deformed state. Now you'll see that this bounding box is really, really large. And to be able to deform this predictably, we would probably want to, reposition this taper and scale it down to be the same size as the object that we want to deform. But this takes a lot of work, and there's an easier way to do this. So what I'm going to do instead is go to the taper object, and since this is a child of this eye base cylinder object, what I can say is right down here in the object tab, I'm going to click this fit to parent. And when I do that, what this deformer is going to do is snap to the bounding box shape of the object that it is a child of. So now you can see that we can now taper this much easier, and we can even move this deformer up and down. And we can even use the size options here to say scale this down in the size Y. So the size here is size X, size Y, and size Z. So X, Y, Z. So I'm just going to adjust the size in the Y here and maybe just move this down. Maybe we can adjust the curvature, which is just how much curvature do we want with that taper. If we bring this to 0, you can see this has no curve at all. If we bring this up past 100%, you can see we get this kind of bulging effect on the one end. Then there's also this fillet checkbox, which if you check that, you can kind of see that we're getting this really nice curve in there, and you can kind of have a lot of control over your taper. So I'm just going to uncheck the fillet there and just kind of bring down the curvature just a little bit. Maybe I don't even want any curvature at all. I just want this to be tapered ever so slightly. Now, maybe I decide that actually I don't want to taper this end. Maybe I want this to actually be wider. So I actually want to flip this taper. Now, instead of just rotating, hitting the R key and rotating this 180 degrees like so, let me just Command or Control Z to undo that. We can actually go into the taper object, and you can see there's this alignment option, which is basically if I use my move tool by hitting E and bring up the axis arrows, if I select the taper object, you can see that the alignment of this taper is going to be tapered in the positive Y direction. So the positive Y is the end that's getting tapered. But if I want to swap this around, I can just say, you know what, let's just use negative Y as the tapered end. And if I change the alignment to negative Y and I hit fit to parent, you can see that now the negative Y is where the tapering is occurring. And now I can kind of adjust this and adjust the size here again and get the exact type of taper that I want. So maybe a little something like this. And then I can zoom out and just see what that looks like. And I'm really liking that amount of taper. Now let's go ahead and move on to, say, this arm here. Now again, I'm going to go and bring my cursor over the object manager and hit S to scroll to first active to reveal the left arm object here that I had selected in the viewport. And what I'm going to do is go back into my Deformers menu and let's taper this cylinder as well. So I'm going to go to taper, and instead of just adding it to my object manager where it will be added to the top of the object manager here, what I'm going to do is hold down the shift key. And when I hold down the shift key, that's a modifier key where if I were to release my mouse over this taper object and have that left arm cylinder selected, if I hold the shift key down and release my mouse, you're going to see that this is going to automatically make the taper object a child of the object we had selected, which was that cylinder. So holding the shift key down with an object selected will make whatever object you're adding to the scene a child of that selected object. So we just saved ourselves a step. And now we can adjust this taper. And you'll notice if I zoom in here that the tapering is happening in the wrong direction. We definitely don't want to taper that way. So what we can do is change that alignment again. So we don't want this taper to align to the Y. We actually want to taper the base of the cylinder, which will be in the negative X direction. So this is positive X and this will be negative X over here. So if I change the alignment to negative X and fit to parent, you'll see that now this will be aligned in the negative X, and I can again adjust the size in the Y here. And you can see we got a little bit of curvature there. And we can kind of just adjust this strength here. And this is looking pretty good. If I just click off of that taper object, you can kind of see what this looks like. And I'd say that's looking really nice. Now, let's go ahead and let's also add a bend to the arm. So the arm and the claw can actually bend. And then the cool thing about that is we can actually like animate that bending deformation. So we've been using tapers so far. So let's go ahead and add a bend deformer here. So I'm going to go ahead and select that cylinder again and go to my Deformers menu, hold that icon button down, and I'm going to go to the bend tool. I have this left arm cylinder selected, and I'm going to hold the shift key down again and release my mouse, and that will make that bend deformer a child of that left arm. And then you'll see that we have the same kind of strength parameters here, but you'll see this is totally bending in the wrong direction here. So let's just kind of zoom in here to see what exactly is going on. So just like the taper object where we had these arrows that was giving us a hint as to where and how this object was going to taper our object, if I select the bend deformer, you can see two arrows. So one arrow that if I increase the strength, you can see starts to bend. So this is where the bend is going to align to in that positive Y. And then the direction in which this is bending to is revealed with the direction in which this arrow is pointing, which corresponds with the angle. If I adjust this angle, you can see if I just kind of orbit overhead here, you can see I'm actually changing the direction in which this object is bending towards. So I'm just going to right click on that arrow to reset that to the default of 0 degrees. So I don't want to bend this up in the Y direction. I actually want to bend this object in the X direction and bend my claw like this, okay? So what I'm going to do is change the alignment from plus Y to plus X. Remember to hit fit to parent again. And now you'll see that my bending arrow, the direction in which this is going to bend, is towards the X direction here. So now I can rotate this, and you can see some kind of chunky polygon action here. And remember how our objects, our primitives, have these segment options. And remember how we can see those segments is going into our garage shading with lines. And remember the shortcut key for that is NB. So I'm going to hit N and then B, and you can see these segments, and you can see why this is getting distorted like it is. This bend deformer is bending a pretty low poly object with very low height segments. We only have 4 height segments to create this bending arc. So to have a smoother bend like this, we need to add more definition or segments to make that a nice smoother curve. So in the height segments on our cylinder, I'm just going to up the segments here. And you can see that as we up those segments, we're getting a much nicer smooth curve. So when using deformers, it's very important to pay attention to how many segments you have, how many subdivisions you have, because to bend or deform in a smooth way, you're going to need to add more definition or more polygons to your object via these segment sliders. So let's get out of the garage shading with lines by hitting N and then A to go back to normal garage shading. And you're going to notice when I bend this cylinder here that it's kind of stretching and deforming a little bit. To prevent that, we can check on this keep length, and we're not going to have that cylinder kind of extend outwards. So we can kind of adjust like this. Another thing you're going to note is that this bend deformer is only affecting this left arm. So how do we get this bend deformer to also bend this left claw sphere? Well, there's 2 ways that a deformer can affect objects. You can either have it be a child of that single object, or if you want to deform multiple objects, you can actually move that deformer to the same level of hierarchy as the objects you want to deform. So I'm just going to move this bend deformer out from underneath, being a child of the left arm, and have it be in the same level of hierarchy as the sphere and the cylinder. And when I release my mouse, you can see that now, with this bend deformer being the same level of hierarchy as both of these objects, I'm now bending both the cylinder and the sphere. Now, when I get this high enough, you are going to see that we're getting some weird stuff happening. That's because this bend deformer is a little bit too long. So what I can do is constrain this bounding box to be just big enough in the Y to just encompass this cylinder. So I'm going to go ahead and go down in the Y centimeters here in the size, and I can move this like so. And now I can bend this like this. Now, the cool thing about deformers is that you can actually animate parameters like the strength. So eventually we can animate the claw arm moving up and down by just keyframing this strength value. So let's zoom out here. And the last thing I want to add a little bit more interesting shape to is the leg. I'd really like to taper the leg and not have this be like such a peg leg looking type of crab leg here. So again, I want to deform this object. I'm going to reveal it in my object manager by having my cursor in the object manager, hitting the S key. there's our left leg capsule. I'm going to go to my Deformers menu here. I'm going to select a taper object. I'm going to hold the shift key down with that left leg capsule selected to make this a child of that selected object, which was that capsule. And you can see that we are going to be tapering by default in this direction. So if I bring the strength up, we're actually tapering inwards, and I actually want to have this flipped. So to do that, we're just going to go to the alignment, go from positive Y to negative Y, hit fit to parent, and now we're going to taper down at this end, which is exactly what I want. Now we can go ahead and move this in the Y direction here and kind of play around with this. And you'll notice that the bounding box is just kind of tapering this object, and there's this harsh cutoff where if I unselect that, you can see where that bounding box ends is where that tapering just kind of continues. So it's just tapering, and this is going to be the size of the rest of this object. Now, if I go back to that taper, and let's just say maybe I wanted this taper to continue. So if you imagine if this tapering continued past this bounding box, we'd kind of shrink even further down. Now, to get that type of effect, we can change the mode where it goes from limited, which means that the deformation's happening within this bounding box and kind of staying the same amount of distortion outside of the bounding box, and say, you know what, have this tapering go unlimited and outside of this bounding box. And you can see now that that taper is going to continue where this actually tapers down and then kind of inverses and grows again. So I can adjust this strength here. I can still move this up or down, but now you can see that that tapering is going to continue and extend beyond that bounding box there. So in some situations, you may want that to be unlimited. Now, if you choose this within box, which I rarely ever do, you can see that outside of this bounding box, there's no distortion at all. So unlike limited, where the distortion kind of just did the distortion and continued that distortion, and where the unlimited also continued beyond that bounding box, within box just keeps all that distortion within that bounding box. Again, this doesn't create really good desired results, so I usually stick with limited or unlimited, and I kind of like unlimited, and I'm just going to adjust this though. So we have this really nice taper going on there. You can also adjust the size and the Y if we wanted to do a little something like this. Let's go ahead and add a bend to the leg as well so it doesn't look so stiff. It still looks kind of like a peg leg. So what I'm going to do is select this left leg capsule again, go up to my Deformers menu. Let's grab a bend deformer. I'm going to hold the shift key down again because I want to make this a child of the left leg capsule. There you go. Not only is it made a child, but it's also automatically fit to parent here. And you can see that the bend arrow means it's going to bend in this direction. Definitely don't want to do that. I want to bend in this direction. So I'll just show you right there. It's bending in the wrong direction. Command Control Z to undo that. The alignment, we just need to flip it from positive Y to negative Y. So I'll change the alignment, hit fit to parent, and now we have this bending, but something doesn't look right. You can see how when I bend this, it looks like part of this object's just kind of sticking. Now, let's see what's going on here. If we go to our left leg capsule here, we have this bend deformer, and then we have this taper. Now, what's actually happening here is that the order of operations, the order in which this object's getting deformed, is that this object's getting bent first and then tapered. So deformers work from top to bottom, just like After Effects effects work from top to bottom. So if I had a blur and a glow, I'm going to have my layer blur first and then a glow. If you had that the opposite way, where you had the glow first and then the blur, that might create undesired results. So that's exactly what's going on here, where actually we don't want to bend and then taper. We actually just want to bend the result of our tapered left leg here. So if I click and move this taper object to go before the bend deformer in the hierarchy, you can see that now we are tapering the leg and then bending the result of that tapered leg. So now we can just bend the leg here. I'm going to click on that keep length so we don't have that extended leg. And now we have this really nice bent leg like so. If I wanted to, I can go in and select the left leg group null and just move this and maybe rotate that just to kind of reposition this as we have this bent leg now. And I would say this is looking really nice. Now we have a lot of bounding boxes kind of cluttering our scene. There's two ways to, once you're done adjusting your deformers, to removing them from cluttering up your viewport. And the first way is using these dots here. So these are actually visibility dots. If I click on the first dot here, it's going to turn green. And if I click on it again, it's going to turn red. And you can see that my Bend Deformer bounding box just disappeared. Now this top dot is the visibility of your object in the viewport. And if I click on the Bend Deformer and go to the Basic tab, you can see we have this visible in editor and visible in renderer. You really don't have to pay too much attention to these options here because these dots basically control these options in this Basic tab. So if I also wanted to hide this in the renderer, which deformer bounding boxes don't actually show up in the renderer anyway, so you really don't need to do this, but I just want to show you when I click that dot, it changes to on. If I click that dot again, the bottom dot, that changes that visible and rendered to off. I'll just click these dots to make them go back to their default, and then I'll click this dot twice to turn this off so it's not viewable in the editor or the viewport. And you can also do this with objects, so I can hide this from the viewport view or turn that on in the viewport view as well. So these tiny dots, we like to call them traffic lights, and they can really help you declutter your viewport. Now, an even easier way to hide all of the deformer bounding boxes from your viewport is to go up to your filters menu, and here's where you can filter out all types of objects from showing up in your viewport. And if we go down here, you can see here's our deformers filter. If I select that, you'll see all of our deformers are hidden. If I go back to the filter and go back down to deformer and activate it again, you can see all of our bounding boxes are turned back on. So either way you want to handle cleaning up your viewport is up to you. The only thing I recommend is if you do have this filter turned off, to remember that that's what's happening when you don't see your bounding box, is that you actually did turn off this deformer filter and to just turn it back on to be able to select those bounding boxes and select those deformers. So you can see how powerful deformers are, giving you a ton of control over your geometry, allowing you to model shapes without needing to learn traditional modeling methods. Now, we only covered a handful of these deformers here, but I encourage you to explore all the other types of deformers here and see what they do, especially the jiggle deformer. It's definitely one of my favorites. Now remember, you can always go and right click on anything and go down to show help to bring up that help menu and learn about and explore all the other type of deformers on your own.